How to deal with hunting pressure on public land. So more than likely going to run into hunting pressure on public land this fall. Here's how to deal with it.
In the past, hunting with you, your strategies always to hunt public land have to battle pressure.
Yeah.
How are you dealing with pressure no matter where you go on public land?
Well, I think I always try to avoid it at all costs. And when I say that, I look back at hunts in the past. The Kansas hunt was a good example where I was out in the spring and basically spring turkey hunting, but essentially I was scouting. Like, I don't know that I would have made that drive just to hunt turkeys, but spring scouting for that whitetail tag in the fall. And I had walked every piece in that unit, and the piece I ended up killing on was the piece that had that most human sign. And I wrote that piece off that spring because it had tree stands up from last season. It had trail cameras out, and it wasn't very big, limited access. So in my mind, I'm like, man, like, this is the most human sign I've seen in this entire unit. It's probably going to get some pressure come fall.
Sure.
I'm probably not going to hunt it. Like, it wasn't necessarily on the top of my priority list to go back there, even though it had the most deer sign.
Mm-hmm.
So fast forward, come fall, we get some bad weather. I decide just to essentially use dirt roads to kind of see where people have been, looking at tire tracks where vehicles have been pulled off the road, and drive past that piece, and there's no pressure. So dive in. Next day you kill, 170-inch whitetail.
Sure.
So I think my strategy when it comes to public land, like, I'm always monitoring pressure, and that comes from looking at vehicles, looking at parking spots and human sign that's left, essentially, right? And if I can avoid it, I'm going to avoid it, because I'm trying to take out, like, on a limited trip where you have 7 days or maybe 10 days, maybe it's 3 days. Like, I don't want to have to deal with those variables, because they're hard to control.
Sure.
A lot of times you can't control them. I've been in scenarios where, like, you spend 2 or 3 days and you're getting close to moving in on a deer, and then that third or fourth day you have somebody that comes walking through there and the whole thing just goes up in flames, and you're like, damn, I just wasted 72 hours or 3 or 4 days on this. Now it's something, you can't control. So I try to stay away from those scenarios. Now, I say that I try to avoid it if you can on the upfront side. Like, putting that in your plan, I think, is smart, but also having enough open mind to realize pressure can also help you.
Sure.
So another scenario in Kansas, hunting on that tag when the upland game season comes in, there's pheasant hunters everywhere.
Yeah.
What do pheasant hunters do? They push and drive fields. You want to locate big bucks? Follow that pressure.
Sure.
So that strategy for that day was actually using pressure to get visuals on deer, watching them jump up out of CRP fields or out of Milo fields or whatever the case was, watching where they went, and then going trying to make a play on them.
Sure.
So I don't want people to think like all pressure is bad, because you can use pressure to your advantage if you understand how the deer are going to react to it.
Yeah,
So
very good point.
There's a lot of different scenarios like that.
Do you do anything on an out-of-state trip with a map to gauge? So you want to try to avoid the pressure. Are you, like, marking access points, and are you going to try to find a spot away from that? Or are you going to go check that access point and be like, okay, there's pressure here. I should write off all these extra pins?
No, I think it's good to mark that stuff on a map and essentially make a priority list to go scout, put boots on the ground and scout. But I don't think you can write it off until you visually go confirm that stuff. But I think it's always smart, because regardless of how much time you have, like, you can't cover everything that you want to cover.
Yep.
And, like, it doesn't matter who you are, how much time you have. That's just always the way that it pans out. So I think it's smart to have a priority list to execute against as you get out there. But I don't think you can actually write those spots off until you visually confirm what is going on.
Yeah, and on pressure, defining pressure, if there was one set of tracks on that dirt road, would you still continue, or would you just said that's enough for me?
No, I would have still continued.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, pressure, it's relative, right? Like, the word pressure, if you get a guy from Iowa that hunts public land Iowa, and then he goes to Wisconsin on a piece, like, he's going to say that everything there is just blown up and there's people everywhere.
Right.
You flip that around and take a guy from Pennsylvania that hunts public land, and you take him to Kansas.
Yeah.
And he's like, there's nobody here.
Right.
Like, it's empty. I've seen 5 vehicles in a day.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's all perspective. So how are you battling? How are you dealing with battling public land pressure on your out of state trips? What's the strategy to get away from people?
You know, growing up, I've always been a public land guy only because I haven't had any private to hunt. So, and what I mean by that is I've spent a lot of time trying to get away from people. And over time, my strategy has actually changed a little bit because I've hunted, and this is fairly recent as I've traveled more, I've hunted areas where there are other people hunting those areas. And so I don't know the answer to dealing with that, but what I do know is the end all be all solution isn't just get away from people, at least from my perspective. I think you have to learn how to use the people to your advantage. Um, and so I'm still in the process of trying to figure that out. Um, but I think for me, it comes down to when am I hunting? That's going to dictate how I'm kind of attacking things. For example, if it's an early season hunt, I'm a little bit more sensitive to pressure because the deer are moving in such a patterned way, right? Whereas if I'm hunting later in the year, I'm less worried about people totally screwing up an area. So that kind of dictates how I go about it. Obviously, I don't like seeing other people out there, but we had a situation last year, right, in Indiana. Um, you know, we were down in the hills, big hills, killing ourselves to get to these spots that no one was around. And we ended up actually, Jake Metallic ended up hunting this spot where he sat there and watched two guys take down a ladder stand and carry it out the evening before. He went in there the next morning and saw the biggest buck of the trip. And it's just in the does too, right? That's kind of what goes into play with my answer, right? The timing. The does are less sensitive to pressure. I know that for a fact. I've bumped more does than anyone would ever think is appropriate, but they don't care as much. And I know that for a fact. So it just depends on the time of year for me. And I guess whatever the location too, right? I mean, in the hills, I think deer tolerate pressure better in the hills because they have more advantages to monitor people moving in and out. People are moving in and out in a more patterned way in the hills because most people aren't hiking up and down hills. So you can get more creative in the hills. So I think it depends on time of year and terrain type for
Yeah, I
sure.
think that's fair. On when you're picking a place to go, public land, you're checking out the map. Are you doing anything with your access points to maybe check for pressure, or are you strictly basing your e-scouting on, okay, this is what looks good on the map, and then with your boots on the ground or driving around, you'll check pressure after that?
I never start with access points. I do take into account, how easy the access is for sure. But when I start e-scouting, it's all about the terrain as it relates to deer. So like, does this set up good for deer? And then I start filtering out based on, the people activity in the area.
So how are you dealing with pressure on public? I mean, how do you battle that? Do you avoid it at all costs? Do you try to use it to your advantage? I mean, what's your perspective on public land pressure?
Yeah, I definitely think about it, and distance, effort to get to spots all comes into play. Avoiding it, sometimes you can't. If there's too much pressure, I'll just pack it up. Like, I'd rather hunt a spot that has low pressure and maybe less deer numbers, but I get more natural style movement than, say, put up with some pressure, maybe higher deer numbers. But yeah, the pressure thing, and it can surprise you. There can be less pressure than you think in certain places, and then other places, man, it's something to account for sure.
Well, how are you judging that? Like, too much pressure? Is that trucks in the parking lot? Is that people in trail camera, on your trail cameras? Like, what qualifies as too much pressure for you?
Yeah, I do feel like I do drive the roads a little bit as far as noting additional hunters. And sometimes you could talk to a guy or even just look and kind of tell how qualified or how much of a threat it is. Like I fear the out of state tag way more because that guy's clearly driven some miles, taken off time, and is probably a little elevated deer hunter. If I see a guy with more mobile equipment, because back in the day, you laugh, until about 3 or 4 years ago, we only ran into one guy with a saddle, and we mainly would see guys in climbers. We never saw guys with standing sticks. When I hunted out of state in Wisconsin, the stand and stick guy was around a lot more. I just, the hunting heritage and the culture of just higher level hunting, I think, is there as far as getting people on kind of more obvious ambush points or obvious scrapes that are maybe near more public access. But I have a theory that it's tough to hunt hard multiple days in a row. And so if a location sucks to get there, it sucks to get there for just about everybody. I will say we see a lot more backdoored public land hunting these days, as far as the local guys that own the 5 that backs up to it. They're in the woods a lot more than they were 10 years ago.
You see any kind of trends there with people? Like one of the things that we've noticed over the last, I don't know, I'm going to say 5 or 6 years, are like these very identifiable terrain features in hill country where guys are like gravitating towards saddles or towards benches that you could see very easily on a topo map, or even some drainages. Are you seeing similar trends in your neck of the woods?
Yeah. And like, I'm not a big e-scouter. I remember back in the day, I just, okay, 1/3 down on the shelf and saddles, right? Like hunt saddles, dude. I think I hunted 20 saddles in a season, saw one doe cross the very highest point of that saddle. And I was like, well, this is doing me no good. And so, yeah, like I'm a big believer. I got to walk something. I got to see in field. Yeah, deer would use this because of X, Y, and Z. And like, I don't spend a lot of time looking at maps. I know that's not sexy to say, but like, dude, I got to see it.